Early opponents of African slavery in England and America. The first importation of slaves from Africa by the English was in 1562, in the reign of Elizabeth. This great princess seems on the very commencement of the trade to have questioned its lawfulness, to have entertained a religious scruple concerning it, and, indeed, to have revolted at the very thought of it. She seems to have been aware of the evils to which its continuance might lead, or that, if it were sanctioned, the most unjustifiable means might be made use of to procure the persons of the natives of Africa. And in what light she would have viewed any of the acts of this kind, had they taken place, we may conjecture from this fact, that when Captain, afterward Sir John, Hawkins, returned from his first voyage to Africa and Hispaniola, whither he had carried away slaves, she sent for him, and, as we learn from Hill's Naval History, expressed her concerns lest any of the Africans should be carried off without their free consent, declaring that it would be detestable, and called down the vengeance of heaven upon the undertakers. Captain Hawkins promised to comply with the injunctions of Elizabeth in this respect, but he did not keep his word, for when he went to Africa again, he seized many of the inhabitants and carried them off as slaves, which occasioned Hill, in the account he gives of his voyage, to use these remarkable words. Here began the horrid practice of forcing the Africans into slavery, an injustice and barbarity which, so sure as there is vengeance in heaven for the worst of crimes, will sometime be the destruction of all who allow or encourage it. Though the slave trade commenced so early, there were no united and effective efforts made for its abolition till the year 1787, at which period a number of persons associated themselves in England for this benevolent object. However, for a long time previous to the forming of this important association, individuals were continually rising, who, by their writings and labors, rendered valuable service to the cause of humanity, and who are properly considered as forerunners inasmuch as they prepared the way for that extensive and united effort, which finally succeeded in rendering illegal the abominable traffic. In giving a history of the abolition of the slave trade, it will be proper to notice a few of the more prominent and active of these harbingers in the great cause of humanity. Morgan Godwin, a clergyman of the Established Church, wrote a treatise upon the subject, which he dedicated to the then Archbishop of Canterbury. He gave it to the world at a time mentioned under the title of the Negroes and Indians Advocate. In this treatise he lays open the situation of these oppressed people, of whose sufferings he had been an eyewitness in the island of Barbados. He calls forth the pity of the reader in an affecting manner, and exposes with a nervous eloquence the brutal sentiments and conduct of their oppressors. This seems to have been the first work undertaken in England expressly in favor of the cause. Richard Baxter, the celebrated divine among the nonconformists, in his Christian Directory, published about the same time as the Negroes and Indians Advocate, gives advice to those masters in foreign plantations who have Negroes and other slaves. In this he protests loudly against this trade. He says expressly that they, who go out as pirates and take away poor Africans, or people of another land who never forfeited life or liberty, and make them slaves and sell them, are the worst of robbers, and ought to be considered as the common enemies of mankind, in that they, who buy them and use them as mere beasts for their own convenience, regardless of their spiritual welfare, are fitter to be called demons than Christians. He then proposes several queries, which he answers in a clear and forcible manner, showing the great inconsistency of this traffic, and the necessity of treating those then in bondage with tenderness and due regard to their spiritual concerns. The person who seems to have noticed the subject next was Dr. Premet. In his dissertation on the duty of mercy and on the sin of cruelty to brute animals, he takes occasion to advert to the subject of the African slave trade. It has pleased God, says he, to cover some men with white skins and others with black. But as there is neither merit nor demerit in complexion, the white man, notwithstanding the barbarity of custom and prejudice, can have no right by virtue of his color to enslave and tyrannize over the black man. For whether a man be white or black, such he is by God's appointment, and, abstractedly considered, is neither a subject for pride nor an object of contempt. In the year 1735, Atkins, who was a surgeon in the Navy, published his voyage to Guinea, Brazil, and the West Indies. In this work he describes openly the manner of making the native slaves, such as by kidnapping, by unjust accusations and trials, and by other nefarious means. He states also the cruelties practiced upon them by the white people, and the iniquitous ways and dealings of the latter, and answers their argument, by which they insinuated that the condition of Africans was improved by their transportation to other countries. In the year 1750, the Reverend Griffith Hughes, rector of St. Lucie in Barbados, published his natural history of that island. He took an opportunity, in the course of it, of laying open to the world the miserable situation of the Africans, and the waste of them by hard labor and other cruel means. Edmund Burke, in his account of the European settlements, complains that the Negroes in our colonies endure a slavery more complete, and attended with far worse circumstances than what any people in their condition suffer in any other part of the world, or have suffered in any other period of time. Bishop Warburton preached a sermon in the year 1766 before the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, in which he took up the cause of the Africans, and in which he severely reprobated their oppressors. The language in this sermon is so striking that we make an extract from it. From the free savages, says he, I now come to the savages in bonds. By these I mean the vast multitudes yearly stolen from the opposite continent and sacrificed by the colonists to their great idol, the god of gain. But what then, say these sincere worshippers of Mammon? They are our property which we offer up. Gracious God, to talk as of herds of cattle, of property and rational creatures, creatures endued with all our faculties, possessing all our qualities but that of color, our brethren both by nature and grace, shocks all the feeling of humanity and the dictates of common sense. But alas, what is there in the infamous abuses of society which does not shock them? Yet nothing is more certain in itself and apparent to all than that the infamous traffic for slaves directly infringes both divine and human law. Nature created man free, and grace invites him to assert his freedom. In excuse of this violation, it hath been pretended that though indeed these miserable outcasts of humanity be torn from their houses and a native country by fraud and violence, yet they thereby become the happier, and their condition the more eligible. But who are you, who pretend to judge of another man's happiness, that state which each man under the guidance of his Maker forms for himself, and not one man for another? To know what constitutes mine or your happiness is the sole prerogative of him who created us, and cast us in so various and different molds. Did your slaves ever complain to you of their unhappiness amidst their native woods and deserts? Or rather, let me ask, did they ever cease complaining of their condition under you, their lordly masters, where they see indeed the accommodations of civil life, but see them all pass to others, themselves unbenefited by them? Be so gracious then, ye petty tyrants over human freedom, to let your slaves judge for themselves what it is which makes their own happiness, and then see whether they do not place it in the return to their own country, rather than in the contemplation of your grandeur, of which their misery makes so large a part. A return so passionately longed for, that, despairing of happiness here, that is, of escaping the chains of their cruel taskmasters, they console themselves with feigning it to be the gracious reward of heaven in their future state. Before the year 1700, planters, merchants, and others, resident in the West Indies, but coming to England, were accustomed to bring with them certain slaves to act as servants with them during their stay. The latter, seeing the freedom and the happiness of servants in that country, and considering what would be their own hard fate on their return to the islands, frequently absconded. Their masters, of course, made search after them, and often had them seized and carried away by force. It was, however, declared by many on these occasions that the English laws did not sanction such proceedings, for that all persons who were baptized became free. The consequence of this was that most of the slaves who came over with their masters prevailed upon some pious clergymen to baptize them. They took, of course, godfathers of Sioux citizens as had the generosity to espouse their cause. When they were seized, they usually sent to these, if they had an opportunity, for their protection, and in the result, their godfathers, maintaining that they had been baptized and that they were free on this account, as well as by the general tenor of the laws of England, dared those who had taken possession of them to send them out of the kingdom. The planters, merchants, and others, being thus circumstanced, knew not what to do. They were afraid of taking their slaves away by force, and they were equally afraid of bringing any of the cases before a public court. In this dilemma, in 1729, they applied to York and Talbot, the attorney and solicitor general for the time being, and obtained the following strange opinion from them. We are of opinion that a slave by coming from the West Indies into Great Britain or Ireland, either with or without his master, does not become free, and that his master's right and property in him is not thereby determined or varied, and that baptism doth not bestow freedom on him, nor make any alteration in his temporal condition in these kingdoms. We are also of opinion that the master may legally compel him to return to the plantations. This opinion was delivered in the year 1729. The planters, merchants, and others gave it, of course, all the publicity in their power, and the consequences were as might easily have been apprehended. In a little time, slaves absconding were advertised in the London papers as runaways, and rewards offered for the apprehension of them. They were advertised also in the same papers to be sold by auction, sometimes by themselves, and again with horses, chaises, and harness. They were seized also by their masters, or by persons employed by them, in the very streets, and dragged from thence to the ships, and so unprotected now were these poor slaves, that persons in no wise concerned with them began to institute a trade in their persons, making agreements with captains of ships going to the West Indies to put them on board at a certain price. These circumstances did not fail of producing new coadjutors in the cause, and first they produced that able and indefatigable advocate, Mr. Granville Sharp. This gentleman is to be distinguished from those who preceded him in this particular, that, whereas these were only writers, he was both a writer and an actor in the cause. In fact, he was the first laborer in it in England. The following is a short history of the beginning and of the course of his labors. In the year 1765, Mr. David Lowe had brought over from Barbados Jonathan Strong, an African slave, as his servant. He used the latter in a barbarous manner at his lodgings in Wapping, but particularly by beating him over the head with a pistol, which occasioned his head to swell. When the swelling went down, a disorder fell into his eyes, which threatened the loss of them. To this an ague and fever succeeded, and a lameness in both of his legs. Jonathan Strong, having been brought into this deplorable situation, and being therefore wholly useless, was left by his master to go whither he pleased. He applied accordingly to Mr. William Sharp, the surgeon, for his advice, as to one who gave up a portion of his time to the healing of the diseases of the poor. It was here that Mr. Granville Sharp, the brother of the former, saw him. Suffice it to say that in process of time he was cured. During this time, Mr. Granville Sharp, pitying his hard case, supplied him with money, and he afterwards got him a situation in the family of Mr. Brown, an apothecary, to carry out medicines. In this new situation, when Strong had become healthy and robust in his appearance, his master happened to see him. The latter immediately formed the design of possessing him again. Accordingly, when he had found out his residence, he procured John Ross, keeper of the poultry compter, and William Miller, an officer under the Lord Mayor, to kidnap him. This was done by sending for him to a public house in Fenchurch Street, and then seizing him. By these he was conveyed, without any warrant, to the poultry compter, where he was sold by his master to John Kerr for £30. Strong, in this situation, sent, as was usual, to his godfathers, John London and Stephen Nell, for their protection. They went, but were refused admittance to him. At length he sent for Mr. Granville Sharp. The latter went, but they still refused access to the prisoner. He insisted, however, upon seeing him, and charged the keeper of the prison at his peril to deliver him up till he had been carried before a magistrate. Mr. Sharp immediately upon this waited upon Sir Robert Kite, the then Lord Mayor, and entreated him to send for Strong, and to hear his case. A day was accordingly appointed. Mr. Sharp attended, and also William McBean, a notary public, and David Laird, captain of the ship Thames, which was to have conveyed Strong to Jamaica, in behalf of the purchaser, John Kerr. A long conversation ensued, in which the opinion of York and Talbot was quoted. Mr. Sharp made his observation. Certain lawyers who were present seemed to be staggered at the case, but inclined rather to recommit the prisoner. The Lord Mayor, however, discharged Strong, as he had been taken up without a warrant. As soon as this determination was made known, the parties began to move off. Captain Laird, however, who kept close to Strong, laid hold of him before he had quitted the room, and said aloud, "Then I now seize him as my slave." Upon this, Mr. Sharp put his hand upon Laird's shoulder, and pronounced these words, "I charge you in the name of the King with an assault upon the person of Jonathan Strong, and all these are my witnesses." Laird was greatly intimidated by this charge, made in the presence of the Lord Mayor and others, and fearing a prosecution, let his prisoner go, leaving him to be conveyed away by Mr. Sharp. Mr. Sharp, having been greatly affected by this case, and foreseeing how much he might be engaged in others of a similar nature, thought it time that the law of the land should be known upon this subject. He applied therefore to Dr. Blackstone, afterwards Judge Blackstone, for his opinion upon it. He was, however, not satisfied with it when he received it, nor could he obtain any satisfactory answer from several other lawyers, to whom he afterwards applied. The truth is, that the opinion of York and Talbot, which had been made public and acted upon by the planters, merchants, and others, was considered of high authority, and scarcely anyone dared to question the legality of it. In this situation, Mr. Sharp saw no means of help but in his own industry, and he determined immediately to give up 2 or 3 years to the study of the English law, that he might the better advocate the cause of these miserable people. The result of these studies was the publication of a book in the year 1769, which he called A Representation of the Injustice and Dangerous Tendency of Tolerating Slavery in England. In this work he refuted, in the clearest manner, the opinion of York and Talbot. He produced against it the opinion of the Lord Chief Justice Hope, who many years before had determined that every slave coming into England became free. He attacked and refuted it again by a learned and laborious inquiry into all the principles of villanage. He refuted it again by showing it to be an axiom in the British Constitution, that every man in England was free to sue for and defend his rights, and that force could not be used without a legal process, leaving it to the judges to determine whether an African was a man. He attacked also the opinion of Judge Blackstone, and showed where his error lay. This book, containing these and other arguments on the subject, he distributed, but particularly among the lawyers, giving them an opportunity of refuting or acknowledging the doctrines it contained. While Mr. Sharp was engaged in this work, another case offered, in which he took a part. This was in the year 1768. Hylas, an African slave, prosecuted a person of the name of Newton for having kidnapped his wife. and sent her to the West Indies. The result of this trial was that damages to the amount of a shilling were given, and the defendant was bound to bring back the woman, either by the first ship or in 6 months from this decision of the court. But soon after the work just mentioned was out, and when Mr. Sharp was better prepared, a third case occurred. This happened in the year 1770. Robert Stapleton, who lived at Chelsea, in conjunction with John Maloney and Edward Armstrong, two watermen, seized the person of Thomas Lewis, an African slave, in a dark night, and dragged him to a boat lying in the Thames. They then gagged him and tied him with a cord, and rowed him down to a ship, and put him on board to be sold as a slave in Jamaica. This action took place near the garden of Mrs. Banks, the mother of Sir Joseph Banks. Lewis, it appears, on being seized, screamed violently. The servants of Mrs. Banks, who heard his cries, ran to his assistance, but the boat was gone. On informing their mistress of what had happened, she sent for Mr. Sharp, who began now to be known as the friend of the helpless Africans, and professed her willingness to incur the expense of bringing the delinquents to justice. Mr. Sharp, with some difficulty, procured a habeas corpus, in consequence of which Lewis was brought from Gravesend just as the vessel was on the point of sailing. An action was then commenced against Stapleton, who defended himself on the plea that Lewis belonged to him as his slave. In the course of the trial, Mr. Dunning, who was counsel for Lewis, paid Mr. Sharp a handsome compliment, for he held in his hand Mr. Sharp's book on the injustice and dangerous tendency of tolerating slavery in England. While he was pleading, and in his address to the jury, he spoke and acted thus: "I shall commit to you," says Mr. Dunning, "what my ideas are upon such evidence, reserving to myself an opportunity of discussing it more particularly, and reserving to myself a right to insist upon a position, which I will maintain in any place and in any court of the kingdom, that our laws admit of no such property." The result of the trial was that the jury pronounced the plaintiff not to have been the property of the defendant, several of them crying out, "No property, no property." After this, one or two other trials came on, in which the oppressor was defeated, and several cases occurred in which slaves were liberated from the holds of vessels and other places of confinement by the exertions of Mr. Sharp. One of these cases was singular. The vessel on board which a poor African had been dragged and confined had reached the Downs, and had actually got under way for the West Indies. In 2 or 3 hours she would have been out of sight, but just at this critical moment the writ of habeas corpus was carried on board. The officer who served it on the captain saw the miserable African chained to the mainmast, bathed in tears, and casting a last mournful look on the land of freedom, which was fast receding from his sight. The captain, on receiving the writ, became outrageous, but, knowing the serious consequences of resisting the law of the land, he gave up his prisoner, whom the officer carried safe, but now crying for joy, to the shore. Though the injured Africans, whose causes had been tried, and though many who had been forcefully carried into dungeons, ready to be transported back into the colonies, had been delivered out of them, Mr. Sharp was not easy in his mind. Not one of the cases had yet been pleaded on the broad ground, whether an African slave coming into England became free. This great question had been hitherto studiously avoided. It was still, therefore, left in doubt. Mr. Sharp was almost daily acting as if it had been determined, and as if he had been following the known law of the land. He wished, therefore, that the next cause might be argued upon this principle. Lord Mansfield, too, who had been biased by the opinion of York and Talbot, began to waver in consequence of the different pleadings he had heard on this subject. He saw also no end of trials like these, till the law should be ascertained, and he was anxious for a decision on the same basis as Mr. Sharp. In this situation, the following case offered, which was agreed upon for the determination of this important question. James Somerset, an African slave, had been brought to England by his master, Charles Stuart, in November 1769. Somerset, in process of time, left him. Stuart took an opportunity of seizing him and had him conveyed on board the Anne and Mary, Captain Knowles, to be carried out of the kingdom and sold as a slave in Jamaica. The question was whether a slave by coming into England became free. In order that time might be given for ascertaining the law fully on this head, the case was argued at 3 different sittings. First, in January 1772. Secondly, in February 1772. And thirdly, in May 1772. And that no decision otherwise than what the law warranted might be given. The opinion of the judges was taken upon the pleadings. The result of the trial was that as soon as ever any slave set his foot upon English territory, he became free. Thus ended the great case of Somerset, which, having been determined after so deliberate an investigation of the law, can never be reversed while the British Constitution remains. The eloquence displayed in it by those who were engaged on the side of liberty was perhaps never exceeded on any occasion. Mr. Sharp felt it his duty, immediately after the trial, to write to Lord North, then Principal Minister of State, warning him in the most earnest manner to abolish immediately both the trade and the slavery of the human species in all the British dominions, as utterly irreconcilable with the principles of the British Constitution and the established religion of the land. In the year 1774, John Wesley, the celebrated divine, to whose pious labors the religious world will be long indebted, undertook the cause of the Africans. He had been in America and had seen and pitied their hard condition. The work which he gave to the world in consequence was entitled Thoughts on Slavery. Mr. Wesley had this great cause much at heart, and frequently recommended it to the support of those who attended his useful ministry. The year 1776 produced 2 new friends in England, in the same cause, but in a line in which no one had yet moved. David Hartley, then a member of Parliament for Hull, found it impossible any longer to pass over without notice the cause of the oppressed Africans. He had long felt for their wretched condition, and, availing himself of this legislative situation, he made a motion in the House of Commons that the slave trade was contrary to the laws of God and the rights of men. Dr. Adam Smith, in his theory of moral sentiments, had, so early as the year 1759, held the slaves up in an honorable and their tyrants in a degrading light. There is not a Negro from the coast of Africa who does not, in this respect, possess a degree of magnanimity which the soul of his sordid master is too often scarce capable of conceiving. Fortune never exerted more cruelly her empire over mankind than when she subjected those nations of heroes to the refuse of the jails of Europe, to wretches who possessed the virtue neither of the countries they came from, nor of those they go to, and whose levity, brutality, and baseness so justly exposed them to the contempt of the vanquished. In 1776, in his Wealth of Nations, he showed in a forcible manner, for he appealed to the interest of those concerned, the dearness of African labor, or the impolicy of employing slaves. In the year 1783, we find Mr. Sharp coming again into notice. We find him at this time taking a part in a cause, the knowledge of which, in proportion as it was disseminated, produced an earnest desire among all disinterested persons for the abolition of the slave trade. In this year, certain underwriters desired to be heard against Gregson and others of Liverpool in the case of the ship Zone, Captain Collingwood, alleging that the captain and officers of the said vessels threw overboard 132 slaves alive into the sea in order to defraud them, by claiming the value of said slaves as if they had been lost in a natural way. In the course of the trial, which afterwards came on, it appeared that the slaves on board the Zone were very sickly, that 60 of them had already died, and several were ill and likely to die, when the captain proposed to James Kessel, the mate, and others, to throw several of them overboard, stating that if they died a natural death, the loss would fall upon the owners of the ship, but that if they were thrown into the sea, it would fall upon the underwriters. He selected, accordingly, 132 of the most sickly of the slaves. 54 of these were immediately thrown overboard, and 42 were made to be partakers of their fate on the succeeding day. In the course of 3 days afterwards, the remaining 26 were brought up on the deck to complete the number of victims. The first 16 submitted to be thrown into the sea, but the rest, with a noble resolution, would not suffer the officers to touch them, but leaped after their companions and shared their fate. The plea which was set up in behalf of this atrocious and unparalleled act of wickedness was that the captain discovered, when he made the proposal, that he had only 200 gallons of water on board, and that he had missed his port. It was proved, however, in answer to this, that no one had been put upon short allowance, and that, as if Providence had determined to afford an unequivocal proof of the guilt, a shower of rain fell and continued for 3 days immediately after the second lot of slaves had been destroyed, by means of which they might have filled many of their vessels with water, and thus have prevented all necessity for the destruction of the third. Mr. Sharp was present at this trial, and procured the attendance of a shorthand writer to take down the facts which should come out of the course of it. These he gave to the public afterwards. He communicated them also, with a copy of the trial, to the Lords of the Admiralty, as the guardian of justice upon the seas, and to the Duke of Portland, as principal minister of state. No notice, however, was taken by any of these of the information which had been thus sent them, but though nothing was done by the persons then in power, in consequence of the murder of so many innocent individuals, yet the publication of an account of it by Mr. Sharp in the newspapers made such an impression upon others that new coadjutors rose up. In the year 1784, Dr. Gregory produced his essays Historical and Moral. He took an opportunity of disseminating in these a circumstantial knowledge of the slave trade, and an equal abhorrence of it at the same time. He explained the manner of procuring slaves in Africa, the treatment of them in the passage, in which he mentioned the case of the ship Zone, and the cruel treatment of them in the colonies. He recited and refuted also the various arguments adduced in defense of the trade. He showed that it was destructive to seamen. He produced many weighty arguments also against slavery itself. He proposed clauses for an act of Parliament for the abolition of both, showing the good both to England and her colonies from such a measure, and that a trade might be substituted in Africa in various articles for that which he proposed to suppress. In the same year, James Ramsay, Vicar of Teston in Kent, became also an able, zealous, and indefatigable patron of the African cause. This gentleman had resided 19 years in the island of St. Christopher, where he had observed the treatment of the slaves, and had studied the laws relating to them. On his return to England, yielding to his own feelings of duty and the solicitations of some friends, he published a work which he called an Essay on the Treatment and Conversion of the African Slaves in the British Sugar Colonies. After having given an account of the relative situation of master and slave in various parts of the world, he explained the low and degrading situation which the Africans held in society in the British Islands. He showed that their importance would be increased, and the temporal interest of their masters promoted, by giving them freedom and by granting them other privileges. He showed the great difficulty of instructing them in the state in which they then were, and such as he himself had experienced both in his private and public attempts, and such as others had experienced also. He stated the way in which private attempts of this nature might probably be successful. He then answered all objections against their capacities, as drawn from philosophy, form, anatomy, and observation, and vindicated these from his own experience. And lastly, he threw out ideas for the improvement of their condition by the establishment of a greater number of spiritual pastors among them, by giving them more privileges than they then possessed, and by extending towards them the benefits of a proper police. Mr. Ramsay had no other motive for giving this work to the public than that of humanity. for he compelled it at the hazard of forfeiting that friendship which he had contracted with many during his residence in the islands, and of suffering much in his private property, as well as subjecting himself to the ill will and persecution of numerous individuals. The publication of this book by one who professed to have been so long resident in the islands, and to have been an eyewitness of facts, produced, as may easily be supposed, a good deal of conversation, and made a considerable impression, but particularly at this time, when a storm was visibly gathering over the heads of the oppressors of the African race. In the year 1785, another advocate was seen in Monsieur Necker, in his celebrated work on the French finances, which had just been translated into the English language from the original work in 1784. This virtuous statesman, after having given his estimate of the population and revenue of the French West Indian colonies, proceeds thus. The colonies of France contain, as we have seen, near 500,000 slaves, and it is from the number of these poor wretches that the inhabitants set a value on their plantations. What a dreadful prospect, and how profound a subject for reflection! Alas, how little are we both in our morality and our principles! We preach up humanity, and yet go every year to bind in chains 20,000 natives of Africa. We call the Moors barbarians and ruffians, because they attack the liberty of Europeans at the risk of their own. Yet these Europeans go, without danger, and as mere speculators, to purchase slaves by gratifying the avarice of their masters, and excite all those bloody scenes, which are the usual preliminaries of this traffic. He goes on still further in the same strain. He then shows the kind of power which has supported this execrable trade. He throws out the idea of a general compact, by which all the European nations should agree to abolish it, and he indulges the pleasing hope that it may take place even in the present generation. In the same year we find other coadjutors coming before our view, but these in a line different from that in which any other belonging to this class had yet moved. Mr. George White, a clergyman of the Established Church, and Mr. John Chubb, suggested to Mr. William Tuckett, the mayor of Bridgewater, where they resided, and to others of that town, the propriety of petitioning Parliament for the abolition of the slave trade. This petition was agreed upon, and when drawn up, was as follows. The humble petition of the inhabitants of Bridgewater showeth that your petitioners, reflecting with the deepest sensibility on the deplorable condition of that part of the human species, the African Negroes, who, by the most flagitious means, are reduced to slavery and misery in the British colonies, beg leave to address this honorable House in their behalf, and to express a just abhorrence of a system of oppression, which no prospect of private gain, no consideration of public advantage, no plea of political expediency, can sufficiently justify or excuse. That, satisfied as your petitioners are that this inhuman system meets with the general execration of mankind, they flatter themselves the day is not far distant when it will be universally abolished, and they most ardently hope to see a British Parliament, by the extinction of that sanguinary traffic, extend the blessings of liberty to millions beyond this realm, hold up to an enlightened world a glorious and merciful example, and stand foremost in the defense of the violated rights of human nature. The petition was presented by the honorable members for the town of Bridgewater. It was ordered to lie on the table. The answer which these gentlemen gave to their constituents relative to the reception of it in the House of Commons is worthy of notice. There did not appear, say they in their common letter, the least disposition to pay any further attention to it. Everyone says that the abolition of the slave trade must immediately throw the West Indian islands into convulsions, and soon complete their utter ruin. Amongst others, the amiable and gifted Cowper did not fail to utter his sentiments in regard to the cruel system. Who has not been impressed by the following lines? We have no slaves at home, then why abroad? And they themselves once ferried over the wave that parts us, or emancipate and loosed. Slaves cannot breathe in England if their lungs receive our air, That moment they are free. They touch our country, and their shackles fall. That's noble, and bespeaks a nation proud and jealous of the blessing. Spread it then, and let it circulate through every vein of all your empire, that where Britain's power is felt, mankind may feel her mercy too. George Fox, the venerable founder of the Society of the Quakers, took strong and decided ground against the slave trade. He was contemporary with Richard Baxter, being born not long after him and dying much about the same time. When he was in the island of Barbados in the year 1671, he delivered himself to those who attended his religious meetings in the following manner. Consider with yourselves, says he, if you were in the same condition as the poor Africans are, who came strangers to you and were sold to you as slaves. I say, if this should be the condition of you or yours, you would think it a hard measure, yea, and very great bondage and cruelty, and therefore consider seriously of this, and do you for them and to them as you would willingly have them or any others do unto you, were you in the like slavish condition. In the year 1727, we find that the whole society, at a yearly meeting held in London, adopted the following resolution. It is the sense of this meeting that the importing of Negroes from their native country and relations by friends is not a commendable nor allowed practice, and is therefore censured by this meeting. In the year 1758, the Quakers thought it their duty, as a body, to pass another resolution upon this subject. At this time, the nature of the trade beginning to be better known, we find them more animated upon it, as the following extract will show. We fervently warn all in profession with us that they carefully avoid being any way concerned in reaping the unrighteous profits arising from the iniquitous practice of dealing in Negro or other slaves, whereby, in the original purchase, one man selleth another, as he doth the beasts that perish, without any better pretension to a property in him than that of superior force, in direct violation of the gospel rule, which teacheth all to do as they would be done by, and to do good to all, being the reverse of that covetous disposition which furnisheth encouragement to those poor ignorant people to perpetuate their savage wars, in order to supply the demands of this most unnatural traffic, by which great numbers of mankind, free by nature, are subject to inextricable bondage, and which hath often been observed to fill their possessors with haughtiness, tyranny, luxury, and barbarity, corrupting the minds and debasing the morals of their children, to the unspeakable prejudice of religion and virtue, and the exclusion of that Holy Spirit of universal love, meekness, and charity, which is the unchangeable nature and the glory of true Christianity. We therefore can do no less than, with the greatest earnestness, impress it upon friends everywhere, that they endeavor to keep their hands clear of this unrighteous gain of oppression. In the year 1696, the yearly meeting for that province took up the subject as a public concern, and the result was advice to the members of it to guard against future importations of African slaves, and to be particularly attentive to the treatment of those who were then in their possession. In the year 1711, the same yearly meeting resumed the important subject, and confirmed and renewed the advice which had been before given. In the year 1754, the same meeting issued a pertinent and truly Christian letter to all the members within its jurisdiction. This letter contained exhortations to all in the connection to desist from purchasing and importing slaves, and, where they possessed them, to have a tender consideration of their condition, but that the first part of the subject of this exhortation might be enforced. The yearly meeting for the same provinces came to a resolution in 1755 that if any of the members belonging to it bought or imported slaves, the overseers were to inform their respective monthly meetings of it, that these might treat with them as they might be directed in the wisdom of truth. In the year 1776, the same yearly meeting carried the matter still further. It was then enacted that the owner of slaves who refused to execute proper instruments for giving them their freedom were to be disowned likewise. In 1778, it was enacted by the same meeting that the children of those who had been set free by members should be tenderly advised and have a suitable education given them. Whilst the body were thus decisive in their measures, individuals of the society were zealous and devoted in their endeavors to promote the same humane cause. Amongst these, Anthony Benezet stands conspicuous. This distinguished philanthropist was born at St. Quentin, in Picardy, of a respectable family, in the year 1713. His father was one of the many Protestants who, in consequence of the persecutions which followed the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, sought an asylum in foreign countries. After a short stay in Holland, he settled with his wife and children in London in 1715. Anthony Benezet, having received from his father a liberal education, served an apprenticeship in an eminent mercantile house in London. In 1731, however, he removed with his family to Philadelphia, where he joined in profession with the Quakers. His three brothers then engaged in trade, and made considerable pecuniary acquisitions in it. He himself might have partaken of their prosperity, but he did not feel himself at liberty to embark in their undertakings. He considered the accumulation of wealth as of no importance when compared with the enjoyment of doing good, and he chose the humble situation of a schoolmaster as according best to his notion, believing that by endeavoring to train up youth in knowledge and virtue, he should become more extensively useful than in any other way to his fellow creatures. He had not been long in this new situation before he manifested such an uprightness of conduct, such a courtesy of manners, such a purity of intention, and such a spirit of benevolence, that he attracted the notice and gained the good opinion of the inhabitants among whom he lived. He had ready access to them in consequence, upon all occasions, and if there were any whom he felt to influence at any of these times, he never went away without the possession of their respect. In the year 1756, when a considerable number of French families were removed from Acadia into Pennsylvania on account of some political suspicions, he felt deeply interested about them. In a country where few understood their language, they were wretched and helpless, but Anthony Benezet endeavored to soften the rigor of their situation by his kind attention towards them. He exerted himself also in their behalf by procuring many contributions for them, which, by the consent of his fellow citizens, were entrusted to his care. One of the means which Anthony Benezet took to promote the cause in question, and an effectual one it proved as far as it went, was to give his scholars a due knowledge and proper impressions concerning it, situated as they were likely to be in after life, in a country where slavery was a custom. He thus prepared many, and this annually, for the promotion of his plans. To enlighten others, and to give them a similar bias, he had recourse to different measures from time to time. In the almanacs published annually in Philadelphia, he procured articles to be inserted, which he believed would attract the notice of the reader and make him pause, at least for a while, as to the lawfulness of the slave trade. He wrote also, as he saw occasion, in the public papers of the day. From small things he proceeded to greater. He collected, at length, further information on the subject, and, winding it up with observations and reflections, he produced several little tracts which he circulated successfully, but generally at his own expense, as he considered them adapted to the temper and circumstances of the times. In the course of this employment, having found some who had approved his tracts, and to whom, on that account, he wished to write, and sending his tracts to others, to whom he thought it proper to introduce them by letter, he found himself engaged in a correspondence which much engrossed his time, but which proved of great importance in procuring many advocates for his cause. In the year 1762, when he had obtained a still greater store of information, he published a larger work. This he entitled, A Short Account of That Part of Africa Inhabited by the Negroes. In 1767, he published a caution and warning to Great Britain and her colonies on the calamitous state of the enslaved Negroes in the British dominions. And soon after this appeared a historical account of Guinea, its situation, produce, and the general disposition of its inhabitants, with an inquiry into the rise and progress of the slave trade, its nature, and calamitous effects. This pamphlet contained a clear and distinct development of the subject from the best authorities. It contained also the sentiments of many enlightened men upon it, and it became instrumental, beyond any other book ever before published, in disseminating a proper knowledge and detestation of this trade. Anthony Benezet may be considered one of the most zealous, vigilant, and active advocates which the cause of the oppressed Africans ever had. He seemed to have been born and to have lived for the promotion of it, and therefore he never omitted any the least opportunity of serving it. If a person called upon him who was going a journey, his first thoughts usually were, how could he make him an instrument in its favor? And he either gave him tracts to distribute, or he sent letters by him, or he gave him some commission on the subject, so that he was the means of employing several persons at the same time, in various parts of America, in advancing the work he had undertaken. In the same manner he availed himself of every other circumstance, as far as he could, to the same end. When he heard that Mr. Granville Sharp had obtained, in the year 1772, the verdict in the case of Somerset, the slave, he opened a correspondence with him, which he kept up, that there might be a union of action between them for the future, as far as it could be effected, and that they might each give encouragement to the other to proceed. He wrote also a letter to the Countess of Huntingdon on the following subject. She had founded a college at the recommendation of George Whitefield, called the Orphan House, near Savannah, in Georgia, and had endowed it. The object of this institution was to furnish scholastic instruction to the poor, and to prepare some of them for the ministry. George Whitefield, ever attentive to the cause of the poor Africans, felt that the institution might have been useful to them also. But soon after his death, they who succeeded him bought slaves, and these in unusual numbers, to extend the rice and indigo plantations belonging to the college. The letter then in question was written by Anthony Benezet, in order to lay before the Countess, as a religious woman, the misery she was occasioning in Africa by allowing the managers of her college in Georgia to give encouragement to the slave trade. The Countess replied that such a measure should never have her countenance, and that she would take care to prevent it. On discovering that the Abbé Raynal had brought out his celebrated work, in which he manifested a tender feeling in behalf of the injured Africans, he entered into a correspondence with him, hoping to make him yet more useful to their cause. Finding also, in the year 1783, that the slave trade, which had greatly declined during the war, was reviving, he addressed a pathetic letter to the Queen who, on hearing the high character of the writer of it from Benjamin West, received it with marks of peculiar condescension and attention. The following is a copy of it. To Charlotte, Queen of Great Britain, impressed with a sense of religious duty, and encouraged by the opinion generally entertained of thy benevolent disposition to succor the distressed, I take the liberty, very respectfully, to offer to thy perusal some tracts, which I believe faithfully describe the suffering condition of many hundred thousands of our fellow creatures of the African race, great numbers of whom, rent from every tender connection in life, are annually taken from their native land, to endure, in the American islands and plantations, a most rigorous and cruel slavery, whereby many, very many of them, are brought to a melancholy and untimely end. When it is considered that the inhabitants of Great Britain, who are themselves so eminently blessed in the enjoyment of religious and civil liberty, have long been, and yet are, very deeply concerned in this flagrant violation of the common rights of mankind, and that even its national authority is exerted in support of the African slave trade, There is much reason to apprehend that this has been, and, as long as the evil exists, will continue to be, an occasion of drawing down the divine displeasure on the nation and its dependencies. May these considerations induce thee to interpose thy kind endeavors in behalf of this greatly injured people, whose abject situation gives them an additional claim to the pity and assistance of the generous mind, inasmuch as they are altogether deprived of the means of soliciting effectual relief for themselves, that so thou mayest not only be a blessed instrument in the hand of him by whom kings reign and princes decree justice, to avert the awful judgments by which the empire has already been so remarkably shaken, but that the blessings of thousands ready to perish may come upon thee, at a time when the superior advantages attendant on thy situation in this world will no longer be of any avail to thy consolation and support. To the tracts on this subject, to which I have thus ventured to crave thy particular attention, I have added some which at different times I have believed it my duty to publish. Footnote. These related to the principles of the religious society of the Quakers, and which, I trust, will afford thee some satisfaction, their design being for the furtherance of that universal peace and goodwill amongst men, which the gospel was intended to introduce. I hope thou wilt kindly excuse the freedom used on this occasion by an ancient man, whose mind, for more than 40 years past, has been much separated from the common intercourse of the world, and long painfully exercised in the consideration of the miseries under which so large a part of mankind, equally with us the objects of redeeming love, are suffering the most unjust and grievous oppressions, and who sincerely desires thy temporal and eternal felicity, and that of thy royal consort. Anthony Benezet. Anthony Benezet, besides the care he bestowed upon forwarding the cause of the oppressed Africans in different parts of the world, found time to promote the comforts and improve the condition of those in the state in which he lived, apprehending that much advantage would arise both to them and the public from instructing them in common learning. He zealously promoted the establishment of a school for that purpose. Much of the last 2 years of his life he devoted to a personal attendance on this school, being earnestly desirous that they who came to it might be better qualified for the enjoyment of that freedom, to which great numbers of them had been then restored. To this he sacrificed the superior emoluments to his former school, and his bodily ease also, although the weakness of his constitution seemed to demand indulgence. By his last will he directed that after the decease of his widow, his whole little fortune, the savings of the industry of 50 years, should, except a few very small legacies, be applied to the support of it. During his attendance upon it, he had the happiness to find, and his situation enabled him to make the comparison, that Providence had been equally liberal to the Africans in genius and talents as to other people. After a few days' illness, this excellent man died at Philadelphia in the spring of 1784. The interment of his remains was attended by several thousands of all ranks, professions, and parties, who united in deploring their loss. The mournful procession was closed by some hundreds of those poor Africans who had been personally benefited by his labors, and whose behavior on the occasion showed the gratitude and affection they considered to be due to him as their own private benefactor, as well as the benefactor of their whole race. Others in America, beside the Quakers, early took the part of the oppressed Africans. In the first part of the 18th century, Judge Seawall of New England came forward as a zealous advocate for them. He addressed a memorial to the legislature, which he called The Selling of Joseph, and in which he pleaded their cause both as a lawyer and a Christian. This memorial produced an effect upon many, but particularly upon those of his own persuasion, and from this time the Presbyterians appear to have encouraged a sympathy in their favor. In the year 1739, the celebrated George Whitefield became an instrument in turning the attention of many others to their condition, and of begetting in these a fellow sympathy towards them. This laborious minister, having been deeply affected with what he had seen in the course of his travels in America, thought it his duty to address a letter from Georgia to the inhabitants of Maryland, Virginia, and North and South Carolina. This letter was printed in the year above mentioned, and is in part as follows. As I lately passed through your provinces on my way hither, I was sensibly touched with a fellow feeling for the miseries of the poor Negroes, whether it be lawful for Christians to buy slaves, and thereby encourage the nations from whom they are bought to be at perpetual war with each other. I shall not take upon me to determine. Sure I am it is sinful, when they have bought them, to use them as bad as though they were brutes, nay, worse, and whatever particular exceptions there may be, as I would charitably hope there are some. I fear the generality of you, who own Negroes, are liable to such a charge, for your slaves, I believe, work as hard, if not harder, than the horses whereon you ride. These, after they have done their work, are fed and taken proper care of, but many Negroes, when wearied with labor on your plantations, have been obliged to grind their corn after their return home. Your dogs are caressed and fondled at your table, but your slaves, who are frequently called dogs or beasts, have not an equal privilege. They are scarce permitted to pick up the crumbs which fall from their master's table. Not to mention what numbers have been given up to the inhumane usage of cruel taskmasters, who, by their unrelenting scourges, have plowed their backs, and made long furrows, and at length brought them even unto death. When passing along, I have viewed your plantations cleared and cultivated, many spacious houses built, and the owners of them faring sumptuously every day. My blood has frequently almost run cold within me, to consider how many of your slaves had neither convenient food to eat, nor proper raiment to put on. Notwithstanding, most of the comforts you enjoy were solely owing to their indefatigable labors. The letter, from which this is an extract, produced a desirable effect upon many of those who perused it, but particularly upon such as began to be seriously disposed in those times, and as George Whitefield continued a firm friend to the Africans, never losing an opportunity of serving them, he interested, in the course of his useful life, many thousands of his followers in their favor. In the year 1772, a disposition favorable to the oppressed Africans became very generally manifest in some of the American provinces. The House of Burgesses of Virginia even presented a petition to the king, beseeching his majesty to remove all those restraints on his governors of that colony, which inhibited their assent to such laws as might check that inhuman and impolitic commerce, the slave trade. And it is remarkable that the refusal of the British government to permit the colonists to exclude slaves from among them by law was enumerated afterwards among the public reasons for separating from the mother country. In allusion to the fact just stated, Mr. Jefferson, in his draft of the Declaration of Independence, said, "He, the King of England, has waged civil war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian King of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold." He prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce, and that this assemblage of whores might want no fact of distinguished dye. He is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us, and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, by murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people, with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. But this passage was struck out when the Declaration of Independence was adopted. But the friendly disposition was greatly increased in the year 1773, by the literary labors of Dr. Benjamin Rush of Philadelphia. In this year, at the instigation of Anthony Benezet, he took up the cause of the oppressed Africans in a little work, which he entitled An Address to the Inhabitants of the British Settlements on the Slavery of the Negroes, and soon afterwards in another, which was a vindication of the first, in answer to an acrimonious attack by a West Indian planter. These publications contained many new observations. They were written in a polished style, and while they exhibited the erudition and talents, they showed the liberality and benevolence of the author. Having had considerable circulation, they spread conviction among many, and promoted the cause for which they had been so laudably undertaken. In the next year, or in the year 1774. Footnote: in this year, Elhanan Winchester, a supporter of the doctrine of universal redemption, turned the attention of many of his hearers to this subject, both by private conference and by preaching expressly upon it. The increased goodwill towards the Africans became so apparent, but more particularly in Pennsylvania, where the Quakers were more numerous than in any other state, that they, who considered themselves more immediately as the friends of these injured people, thought it right to avail themselves of it. And accordingly, James Pemberton, one of the most conspicuous of the Quakers in Pennsylvania, and Dr. Rush, one of the most conspicuous of those belonging to the various other religious communities in that province, undertook, in conjunction with others, the important task of bringing those into society who were friendly to this cause. In this undertaking they succeeded. This society, which was confined to Pennsylvania, was the first ever formed in America, in which there was a union of persons of different religious denominations in behalf of the African race. But this society had scarcely begun to act when the war broke out between England and America, which had the effect of checking its operations. This was considered as a severe blow upon it. But as those things which appear most to our disadvantage turn out often the most to our benefit, so the war, by giving birth to the independence of America, was ultimately favorable to its progress. For as this contest had produced during its continuance, so it left, when it was over, a general enthusiasm for liberty. Many talked of little else but of the freedom they had gained. These were naturally led to the consideration of those among them who were groaning in bondage. They began to feel for their hard case. They began to think that they should not deserve the new blessing which they had acquired, if they denied it to others. Thus, the discussions which originated in this contest became the occasion of turning the attention of many, who might not otherwise have thought of it, toward the miserable condition of the slaves. Nor were writers wanting who, influenced by considerations on the war and the independence resulting from it, made their work subservient to the same benevolent end. A work entitled, A Serious Address to the Rulers of America on the Inconsistency of Their Conduct Respecting Slavery, forming a contrast between the encroachments of England on American liberty and American injustice, and Tolerating Slavery, which appeared in 1783, was particularly instrumental in producing this effect. This excited a more than usual attention to the case of these oppressed people, and where most of all it could be useful. For the author compared it in two opposite columns, the animated speeches and resolutions of the members of Congress, in behalf of their own liberty with their conduct in continuing slavery to others. Hence, Congress began to feel the inconsistency of the practice, and so far had the sense of this inconsistency spread, that when the delegates met from each state to consider of a federal union, there was a desire that the abolition of the slave trade should be one of the articles of it. This was, however, opposed by the delegates from North and South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and Georgia, the 5 states which had the greatest interest in slaves. But even these offered to agree to the article, provided a condition was annexed to it, which was afterwards done, that such abolition should not commence till the 1st of January, 1808. In consequence of these circumstances, the Society of Pennsylvania, the object of which was for promoting the abolition of slavery and the relief of free Negroes unlawfully held in bondage, became so popular that in the year 1787, it was thought desirable to enlarge it. Accordingly, several new members were admitted into it. The celebrated Dr. Franklin, who had long warmly espoused the cause of the injured Africans, was appointed president. James Pemberton and Jonathan Penrose were appointed vice presidents. Dr. Benjamin Rush and Tench Coates, secretaries. James Starr, treasurer.